An engineer dies and goes up to the pearly gates. St. Peter looks over the dossier and says, "You've come to the wrong place," and sends him to hell. And shortly thereafter, Satan is talking to God on the telephone and tells God that they've got this marvelous engineer down there in the hell, and now hell has all sorts of incredible features that the engineer has built. He's just continually improving the place. They've got flush toilets, they've got air conditioning, they've got escalators, and then God goes back to St. Peter. He looks up the dossier, he determines there's been an error, he says, "Well, wait a second, that engineer's supposed to be up here in heaven. We want him back." And Satan says, no way, we're not sending that engineer back up to you all. He's making incredible improvements. God says, "Well, if you keep this up, we're going to have to sue." And what do you think the devil says? "Yeah, good luck finding a lawyer." Another little story. Two people out on a mountaintop. They are hiking, and they run across a mountain lion. There's this mountain lion licking his lips and looking at them rather hungrily. One of the men, a lawyer, is quickly taking off his boots and putting on what? His running shoes. And his friend turns to him and says, You're an idiot. You can't possibly outrun a mountain lion." And the lawyer turns to him and says, "I don't have to outrun the mountain lion. I just have to outrun you." Third story, and trust me, this is the last one. A lawyer and a physician are involved in a car accident. They're sitting by the side of the road, both a little bit dazed, not in any serious condition, but waiting, in effect, for the cops and the ambulance crew to show up. The lawyer gets out a flask of whiskey, offers it to the doctor. The doctor says, "Thanks, it'll steel my nerves," takes several swigs, hands it back to the lawyer, says to the lawyer, "Hey, aren't you going to drink any?" And the lawyer says, "No, I think I'll have mine after the police have arrived." Now, what's the gist of those stories and hundreds of other stories like that? Clever lawyers, but not necessarily honest lawyers. They don't go to heaven afterwards. The idea I would like to get across is, under professionalism and under standards of what we expect of our lawyers in the business context, is we sort of have contradictory notions. It's kind of a yin and yang, good versus evil, flip side of the coin question. For instance, in that video you just saw, we have two somewhat different views of what a lawyer's role might be. One view is of a vicious but effective lawyer. The other view is perhaps of a virtuous but not necessarily best for the individual client in terms of optimal results attorney. The reason for that is that law often entails an adversarial process. If you're talking about lawsuits, for instance, one side typically loses, if not both sides. This is not the case in other fields. If you look at the four great ancient professions, medicine, ministry, teaching, and law, the first three of those don't really have to deal with an adversarial process. When somebody's operating on you there, it's not like there's a competing team of physicians trying to do in the patient. When someone is trying to teach, there's usually not someone in the back of the room trying to come up with a competing point of view, simultaneous to the lecturer there in the front of the stage or the classroom. If you go into a church, a synagogue, a mosque, the cleric speaking up at the front usually does not have to compete with someone in the back who has some sort of counterpoint of view, the point of view of Satan, for instance. So there's no adversarial process that they have to deal with. And I think also the goals are often viewed as so admirable. You know, a physician tries to save a life, a teacher tries to save a mind, a clergyman tries to save a soul. And what does the lawyer do? usually concentrating, particularly in the civil context, on simply saving people some money. And while money is useful, money makes the world go round, it probably isn't viewed as being as significant as a life, a soul, a mind. So lawyers, I think, naturally, by the adversarial process and what their goals are more likely to run into disrepute, even if they do have the highest of motives. But on occasion, we can point to instances where certainly lawyers do not meet those high motives, do not behave in a professional manner. In that skit, or series of skits, 2 scenes, I'm hoping that when you look at it, you kind of evaluate which attorney would I prefer. Would you prefer the first attorney who in effect says, I'm going to do the right thing and try and bring you along to do the right thing because that's better in the long run for all of us, for us as a society? Or would you rather go along with the second attorney who may not be doing the most moral or ethical things, but you believe in your gut is more likely to give you a good result for this particular case? Lawyers' ethics and behavior do not occur in a vacuum. I mean, we often look at them and act as if that's all it is it's the lawyers or the legal system. But we also have to include in the mix what the clients seek, what the clients expect, what business operations are entailed in some sort of legal hiring process. And what I think you have to look at here is the internal conflict we often have in terms of what we ourselves want. And 2 examples by analogy would be the attitude we often have towards politicians, towards, say, Congress, for instance, and what is referred to as the economics thrift paradox. First, let's take Congress. Study after study shows that while Congress has a very low reputation ordinarily in the eyes of the public, collectively, if you look at the individual congressmen and women, they are not necessarily viewed that harshly by their constituents. Individual constituents are very likely to reelect and reelect and reelect their congressmen or congresswomen. Part of that may be the problems with campaign finance and the difficulties for challengers to make any headway and gerrymandering and other issues. But clearly part of it is, on an individual basis, people are often happy with their individual representatives. They just don't like collectively what the representatives are doing. And obvious examples of this are we often denigrate the pork that comes out of Congress, but when it comes to individual projects which could benefit our own district, we often are upset if a congressman doesn't do his or her level best to get that pork coming to us. Kind of like a lawyer, where we denigrate the lawyers as a whole, but on an individual basis, we want that vicious but effective lawyer. Another example, in economics, I've been told by economists there is something called a thrift paradox, which essentially means people ordinarily, in order to advance within an economy, need to have the overall market structure encourage spending. But on an individual basis, that person should be thrifty. So it's a thrift paradox in the sense that the only way for you to advance is for you to be more thrifty than what you want other people to be. You save, you reinvest, you build your capital. But the other people in the economy are less thrifty. They're more likely to spend. And in particular, you want them to spend on your goods, on your services. So as a whole, you want people to do things differently than what you want on your own personal front in terms of an economy. Again, there's often just a difference in view between business and lawyers. Sometimes I think it is actually the lawyers who are more idealistic than the clients. I know when I was practicing law full-time, I was sometimes disabused of my starry-eyed notions as to what I was doing For instance, there was a case where I was defending someone who was quite adamant that he was not in any way intoxicated when he was pulled to the side of the road. And he went on and on about how he'd been at a baseball game and they stopped serving after the 7th inning, and this baseball game went into extra innings, and by the time he was pulled over by the cops, he'd already been driving for half an hour. He had just dropped off a friend. He couldn't possibly have had a very high blood alcohol level. Now, he refused to take a test of his blood alcohol level. I had some doubts, but I went in with rather starry-eyed notions as a fairly young attorney that I was doing my utmost for probably an innocent person. Shortly before the trial took place, there was a proposal by the prosecutors to bump down the charges from, in effect, driving while intoxicated to driving under the influence, a lesser charge. I, as was my duty, presented it to the client after telling the prosecutor that I don't think we'll accept that. I suspect we're going to go to trial because we have a really strong defense. I presented it to the defendant, and he immediately rolled over. He immediately said, well, maybe I did have far too many drinks. Maybe I probably was drunk. And it was just one example of many that I can give you of where I believe I was individually more idealistic than the client. And you can probably talk to plenty of other attorneys who have felt themselves to be in the same position. Classic example, a lawyer goes to court, has a trial, the client cannot attend, so after the trial is over and the lawyer has won, the lawyer sends a cryptic email to the client, justice triumphs. What does the client respond? Its reply and writes back, appeal immediately. The difference in notions. The lawyer thinking it's justice, the client realizing that maybe justice is not on his side. There are a lot of things that are involved in this whole legal process and what is fair and what is right. One example that I like to bring up in this area is the whole question of, and students often ask me, of how far can a lawyer go in terms of helping a client in testimony. When is it really a lie versus when is it simply obfuscation or failure to state things or misleading? And there are some real gray areas here. I think a lot of people are more troubled by lies and subterfuge in criminal proceedings than they are in civil proceedings. And the only way I can account for that is I think people maybe view criminal proceedings as even more important. There you're talking about actual crimes, you're talking about people trying to avoid going to jail, you're talking about whether we need to incarcerate people to help prevent future crimes or deter crime. Whereas in the civil context, I think a lot of people are more likely to view that as more in the area of gamesmanship. And people are more likely to view it as a distinct possibility that they will be involved in a lawsuit, whether they want to or not, whereas most people assume they will never be charged with a crime. So for the criminal proceedings, people may have a much more idealistic collective notion of the lawyer should always do the ethical thing, the right thing, lying should not be condoned, helping a guilty person go free should not be permitted. Whereas in the civil context, people are more likely to see things in shades of gray. They could see how they might get involved. They could see how one side having a better attorney or a little bit more gamesmanship, while maybe not the most wonderful thing in the world, is part of the process and perhaps acceptable. We saw a lot of those arguments being put forth in the recent problems with President Clinton and impeachment proceedings and the like in terms of, is it somehow different to be lying or misleading in a civil deposition, for instance, particularly in a deposition in a case which people think wasn't really worth much, versus lies or misleading in a criminal case, versus doing it in court rather than just during the discovery process. And people can often see shades of gray here. I would argue that the real problem you face with holding that the ethical minimum should be the same as the legal minimum is it makes difficult the process of growth of change, of progress. Because if the ethical minimum is always just there with the legal minimum, there is no real incentive for people to improve. If there really is this notion that ethics are beyond and above law, then people can still be scandalized, can still be subject to moral outrage, even if they are not subject to legal discipline, because they are viewed as having violated society's ethical norms. But if the ethical norms are no different than the legal norms, how can you go after them? How can you scandalize them? How can you subject them to moral outrage? One last point I'd like to make in this area, and that is, I'm not saying it always holds, but at least it's something to think about. If you are in a position where you kind of say, yeah, I'm like a lot of people. I want a collectively honest Congress, but I want the port coming to my district. I want good lawyering and ethical lawyering generally, but I have to admit on individual cases, I might want an unscrupulous, somewhat unethical attorney if I believe he or she is more likely to do a good job for me. My warning to you is, how do you know that the unethical professional, be it a lawyer, an accountant, whomever, is still ethical enough that he or she can draw lines between his own self-interest and your interests? You've already determined he can't draw the lines between your interests and that of society, that he'll always fight for you even if there are other points of view, other ethical dictates of honesty, of fairness, etc., competing against your interests. But if he's not able to draw the line in the broader context, will he still be able to draw the line between your interest and his? For instance, you have a dispute about the fee. Will that lawyer then become honest, ethical enough to, even though he wasn't that honest or ethical in the broader proceedings, to be honest and ethical in his or her dealings with you? He or she is supposed to be, but I think human nature is such that sometimes it's difficult for people to draw lines. That's the old policy, the old issue of, can people really be publicly moral and privately immoral, or vice versa? If you believe that's possible, then I suppose you can also believe that a lawyer can be very ethical towards his lawyer and just a dirtbag towards his client and a dirtbag towards everyone else. I'm not sure, given human nature, whether it is really that easy for people to draw lines, including for professionals to draw lines in terms of when they're going to behave ethically versus when they are not.